Welcome to Guardians of the Directory, the KOSoft podcast dedicated to all things Active Directory management, security, and recovery. I'm Craig Birch, your host, identity security enthusiast and principal security engineer. With over 2 decades of industry experience architecting and securing Microsoft solutions. Well, enough about me. Let's focus on today's discussion. But before we dive into today's topic, make sure you catch our last episode, Zero Trust Unveiled, a cybersecurity essential with special guest, Jerry Chapman. In our first episodes, we have been focused on cyber attacks and recovery. Today, we're going to mix things up as we have a special guest with us, who is one of the original directory experts who I joked as the godfather of directory service, Kevin Kampman. Kevin, for those that might not know you, can you give some insight on your career?
Hey, welcome to the show, Kevin. I really appreciate you joining. Can you give the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you have done in the past?
Well, Craig, thank you for having me. I am a retired analyst. I spent 40 years in industry working for someone else, and most recently I was an analyst at Gartner for about 24 years, and I was primarily concentrating on identity management and security and risk. And I've written, I feel like I've written the book on that. In my career at Gartner, I think I've had my hand in just about everything. But I work in the commercial and government field. I've been involved in new product development and marketing and so forth with some of the companies that I worked for. I worked for at least 4 of the major computer companies, and before I went to Gartner. So I've had my hand in a lot of different things over those 40 years. But now I'm retired and I'm doing what I want to do, but it's in my blood and I can't get away from it.
So where did you first get your start with directory services, though?
So it really started when I was working with the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I was the systems engineering manager for the merger of the Systems and Logistics Command, which involved about 280,000 people at least 8 big facilities.
So a small group.
And I cut my teeth on that. That organization was in an evolution from, well, you had mainframe, you had a heavy Unix infrastructure, and these were the days of the introduction of PCs into these organizations. So we were helping them to transition from green screens to PCs.
Interesting. So in a previous conversation I had with you, you mentioned some work that you've done with either TWR or NCR. Do I have that correct?
Yes. And at NCR, so if you take that view of TRW and you say, okay, well, what were you doing there? Well, we were introducing messaging systems for the PC LAN. And so again, this was in the days of NetWare, and that was mostly based on a NetWare stack, including message handling system or MHS and the clients that lived on that in a Windows environment. So coming out of that, some of the challenges that we encountered were that you had mainframe messaging systems, you had the Unix-based messaging systems, you had the PC-based messaging systems. And we're talking about a global infrastructure where we were trying to do message translation and address translation, and message passing and conversion and so forth. So my experience came out of the messaging and directory space. So there was a market need for products that would do the translation of addresses and messages on the fly, regardless of the systems that they came from. And those systems had very rigid naming conventions in many cases. And so we had to be able to go from an IBM or a DEC address to a LAN address and be able to reply to that and reply to all. So there could have been multiple systems mixed into that. So when I went to NCR, we were involved in the development of, they had committed to X400, X500 and an OSI product set. And that's Open Systems Interconnect. And they selected an X400 product vendor, and an X500 product vendor that they were reselling. And I came in as part of their professional services organization to help them develop a product that would do the message and naming management on top of, well, with X500 and all those other systems that I mentioned. So we were evaluating the market and trying to find partners that we could put together into a huge message switch. I said, all this stuff comes together, we can redirect it and translate it and so forth. And I worked with some of the early players in that space because no one vendor did it all. So we had to
So
look
what
at
were some of those early players? Can you give the audience a little bit of background?
Sure. There was a company called Innosoft, and there was another company called Boston Software Works, and World Talk was another company that did this, and Control Data Systems did this as well. So we were looking at the independent companies and saying, could we package this into a product offering or as recommended partners for a service offering? And we got into that in quite a bit of detail and contractually and otherwise to put together a product set that NCR customers and then AT&T products, because in the middle of all that, AT&T bought them. So we had the Unix world right there in the mix too. And how do you put together a comprehensive solution that could communicate or basically route and translate all of this information? Because messaging was probably the killer app for networks. It was the ability to communicate. There were other features as well, but that was the big one.
So basically, you're talking about bringing all these different disparate systems and make them work together in a comprehensive way. So if we think about like going through our training, you're really talking about distributed computing, the early days of distributed computing in networking.
Right, because prior to PCs and LANs, we had mainframe systems that were connected over their own proprietary protocols. You had DECnet, you had SNA for IBM, and so forth, and those were closed systems. And Unix came along, and it was an open system, and so there were opportunities for other vendors to come in and play in that space. And this was when, that's why we had the coining of the term open systems.
Right.
And so at the same time, IBM put the PC out there and Microsoft came along with DOS, and there was some standardization taking place. And prior to Windows, there were networks, but it wasn't Windows.
Right.
When OS2 and LAN Manager and Network and Windows came along, then it got really interesting. In fact, you used to buy your network stack separately from the operating system. So there were companies that sold that, Wollongong and FTP Systems and others, even DCA 10net. There was a lot of people trying to figure out how to make all these work together. And so if I had to look at the two major leaders in the market, you had Novell and you had the NetBIOS crowd, right? The Microsoft, the early Microsoft environment. So these were competing systems all along.
So kind of going back, because I started my career learning Banyan Vines, right? I think they were probably one of the earliest ones out there as well. And then you mentioned NetWare, right?
Right.
And then, you mentioned Microsoft, and you mentioned that you have the operating system, and then you have to install this network operating system or IP stack on top of this network operating system. And I do remember in my early careers going around with a disk, by the way, and loading the Novell client on Windows machines so we could get them to talk to NetWare.
Right. And for everybody who's on this, if you're familiar with the IP stack, it's a 7-layer stack, and it starts at the physical and it ends at the presentation layer, right? So this is how you get things out on the wire and then bring it back up. And the OSI stack was a couple more layers. It didn't really pan out. There was a community at one time, but TCP/IP became the model. And NetWare had its own stack, and that kind of set it apart because it was really fast, but it was proprietary, and the market was moving towards open systems. So it took a while. It took a long time, actually, but in fact, even NetWare, even Novell, even sold the cards, right?
Right.
So it took a long time for the industry to move away from that because it was really good and it worked really well. But Microsoft took it on with Windows, and the IP stack vendors took it on with their products and provided competition. In fact, we had two physical layer protocols that we were dealing with environments, Ethernet and Token Ring.
And I did some work with Token Ring as well, so absolutely painful. By the way, painful.
Yeah, and one of the vendors I worked for was a Token Ring manufacturer. That was the IBM product, and
Okay.
so we had competition. Today, you don't have those issues, right? The operating system includes the network stack.
Right.
And so it's just not something that you have to think about anymore. At one time, it was something you really had to think about.
Yeah, like I mentioned, even in, I'll say, early 2000s, 2002, 2003, I was working at a company and we were still running NetWare, and we were installing the network client on new PCs as we were, coming along to moving over to something called Active Directory as well,
Right.
because we were going through mergers and acquisitions. We were primarily a network company, but the company that we were buying was actually running, I think, I want to say NT35 or NT40. So I'm really dating myself, but really, and that's when we started seeing this, basically the move away from having a separate network operating system. And maybe we saw it before that, but that's when I kind of seen, is when I got into the Microsoft stack.
So I think it's helpful to think about going back to my messaging and directory experience. When Active Directory came out, it wasn't alone, right? Microsoft had an operating system. They had a messaging system. At that time, it was Exchange.
Correct. Yep.
Right? And they had LAN Manager, and LAN Manager had a naming system. Every network directory has a way to authenticate, to authorize, and to manage or route information between servers. And in those days, there was a lot of dial-up. So you really needed some sophisticated products to keep track of how to move that information around on the wire, which you don't have to worry about so much today because it's much flatter and very unlikely you spend a lot of time dealing with that. And so now it's there. Then it was not. And so this is why we had the whole notion of the distributed set of servers and the domain servers and all these different boxes with different kinds of rights and responsibilities to exchange information, but underlying all that to do the routing. So Microsoft needed to advance the capabilities of authentication, authorization, data management or sharing, and collaboration. It wasn't just messaging, it was calendaring and all these other tools.
Sure. Right.
That made a network useful. And but messaging was really, again, the killer app. And you needed a way to identify people, identify where they were at in the organization, map that to the physical network infrastructure. So we had this binding of all these different elements and doing it on top of or leveraging TCP/IP, which had its own mechanisms to do that. So they had to map to that. And they picked the OX 400, X 500 model as an industry standard that was recognized to build Exchange X 400 on Exchange for Exchange, X 500 for Active Directory. But they did it in a way that dealt with the particulars of the network operating system environment, because X500 was designed to be an international, global naming and routing mechanism, right? And it was distributed information systems. Some of the things that aren't there are the way to, let's say we take this directory and this directory, and we want to branch from one into the other. Mechanisms were there to do that and do things like replication. Hugely complicated, hugely sophisticated, not so much necessary in a network operating system, right?
And I mean, if we go back to even when we start talking about Active Directory, that was released in 2000, right? So I know that for a fact because the general release date and I share the same birthday. So 80 is basically, was general release date was February 17th in 2000. So it's going to be 25 years old this year. The reason why I'm bringing that, right, because if we start thinking about that, the early days of Active Directory, and you mentioned replication between these different domain controllers, there was no such thing as delta replication. So on these small networks, if you recall, when we're replicating the directory for these different services, including later Microsoft Exchange, because it heavily relied on Active Directory when it moved over to Exchange 2000, if you recall. There would be these replication storms that would occur inside of an organization because you're replicating the entire directory set. It wasn't until later, I want to say 2003 or that we started seeing enhancements in directory replication. In fact, if we kind of think back to that first time, and it's still that way today, if a replication between sites, between different physical locations, the default was 3 hours because of dial-up and poor network connectivity. And it's still, I believe it still is, even if you stand that up on a new Active Directory. So it's kind of interesting, as you mentioned, because the directory, we were doing messaging, right, sending email back and forth, but we weren't really needing to replicate this directory to different parts of the business. Whereas now I feel like with Active Directory, that has become the norm.
Right. As the capacity and the speed of the networks increased, the distinctions went away, started to go away. And so, and there's an awful lot more outsourcing and so forth to, as it became it's very sophisticated, but as it became less complicated, that became a service that organizations sat on top of. So you don't need to be as concerned in today's world as you did then in terms of how long it took to get data out there and so forth. And 3 hours on that network is kind of unheard of, right? That's what are we talking about here?
So if we go back to like the release of Active Directory, what was so pivotal? I mean, obviously you were in the early days of this. So, and I think you said you touched, from previous conversation with me, you touched Active Directory before it hit GA in 2000. So what was so pivotal about Active Directory that made organizations adopt and move away from NetWare? Can you give some insight there?
Right. This was a competition, by the way. So remember I said Novell's stack was proprietary and very, very efficient, and they had the same competitive products. They had a directory service. It's called eDirectory. And in fact, I know the guy that wrote it. So
there's still companies that are running it, believe it or not.
I'm sure they started selling it as a separate directory service, and it's a good directory. And so directories started to standardize, right? So Microsoft picked X5 as its model for what it did. It built its own network management capabilities and object management capabilities into the directory. There are a lot of things that aren't people-based that are built into the directory that required extensions and so forth. But again, it gave you a good authentication platform. It gave you a good authorization platform. It managed people and objects, and it could do it in a distributed environment. So as their applications started to leverage the directory, it became a key to using all the applications that were coming onto the market by third parties and Microsoft itself. And in fact, Active Directory was a little fragile when it started out. You could break it. And over time, it became self-healing and something that organizations relied on so that they didn't have to build their own directory service. That was the last thing you wanted to do, was build your own directory service into your products. So it became, they had a good developer community. They made it open. They made it available to their partners and providers and so forth. Another thing that we didn't mention, and I thought of this the other morning when I do my best thinking, and I said, we didn't mention that directory services also had, and messaging had a real business need behind them, because X500 and X400 were the basis for EDI, electronic data interchange. So supplier networks relied on it to do business. So we can talk about the LAN environment and so forth, but there was infrastructure and whole industries that were looking at this and saying, how do we do this securely across the supply chain? So think about the automotive industry. I work with the automotive industry on this as they built their own internal industry network. It's called the Automotive Network Exchange. And they had to have a mechanism to do authentication, authorization, and information exchange. So this is, think about your local area network, but realize industries were behind this. And so for Microsoft to step in with a standards-based solution was very attractive to the marketplace in terms of their ability to rely on something that everybody else was working with as well, right? So I think what it was mostly the open piece and the competitive nature of what was happening in the marketplace. These things continued to expand, right?
So there wasn't any proprietary. So to run this directory, right, you didn't have to have dedicated proprietary hardware, as you mentioned, with some of the other solutions out there.
Less so. I will say less so. Okay. So Active Directory is its own beast.
Sure, right. I mean, obviously you have to have Windows to run it on, so which is a proprietary operating system, but it would run on regular hardware where you didn't have to go in and buy like a Microsoft specific network adapter or a Microsoft specific machine. It just has to be PC based, right? And run Windows.
Staying out of the hardware market.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Well, some of these other ones may have not, and it sounds like business demand kind of drove some of that shift to the wide adoption of Microsoft Active Directory. I mean, obviously that sort of happened in 2000s, but I would say that most organizations, it was later on where we started seeing a massive shift away from NetWare over to Microsoft and I think, like you said, it was an open system and there was a lot of applications already being developed for Active Directory. So application demand was driving it. And I feel like most of the businesses were moving to a Windows PC architecture.
Yes.
And correct?
Don't discount the Unix environment.
Sure.
Because there is always going to be that community, and it's standards based. And so the easier it is to integrate and couple those, the more likely it is that people will choose that solution, because we don't want to spend all our time trying to patch this stuff together.
Sure.
It was fun. It's not fun anymore. It's not now. Right. So, but we learned it the hard way. And so market demand, I think more than anything else, forced the industry to standardize. And Active Directory was a more standardized solution in relation to the operating systems that people were using. Although, and keep in mind, Microsoft had an LDAP interface, right? So, and I know that was also driven, in my view, by the automotive industry, because there was a lot of LDAP, lightweight directory access protocol, demand in industry. It's still out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of applications that do, today, right? I mean, they connect, integrate through ODAP, as you mentioned.
And the SCIM protocol, for example, that's one of the leading advancements in the ability to exchange this information. That's still standards based, and Microsoft, again, they can carve out the interfaces that are needed to interface to that, and they do trail that. And some of the people in the product management space at Microsoft, Mark Wall and people like that, have been around this for a long time. And they know where the bodies are buried and where the skeletons are. So they know this stuff intrinsically and know how to adapt to these changing needs.
So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about. Obviously, we've talked kind of about the history of directories and how Active Directory became the predominant. So going back in your career, and specifically with Windows and Microsoft Active Directory, what lessons from the past do you think are critical for today's directory administrators? Do you have any advice?
Sure. It was interesting when being an analyst, we wrote and thought about the problems people brought to us, and one of those was naming.
Okay.
We as you move into that presentation layer, it becomes less restrictive. Now, email addresses, you have user at domain.
Sure.
You have to have a unique username to do messaging. You have to have a unique username to do authentication on your network. And if you're handed a job to do and saying, okay, name people, how are we going to do that? And so you laugh, but this became, if you will, the key element.
Well, I laugh because I've lived this where we can't come up with a common naming standard for our users.
Right.
Are they going to be 3251 at company name, or are they going to be first dot last, first initial last name? Oh, do we want that?
Imagine an 8-character username.
Right.
I mean, that was what we started with in the mainframe days.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing is, like, for backward compatibility, we were locked into short usernames for the SAM account name for sure. Obviously, it still is that, but some of those systems could only do 8 characters, so you would have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 at whatever.
And that's not a user-friendly name, right?
It's not, right?
So you want to be able to use something that translates into something that the machine understands. That's, by the way, what DNS does, right? You that whole domain name thing, you don't type in IP addresses unless you're really, really into something wild. And you don't want your users to have to think about that. You don't even really want them to think too much about domain naming. And so you want your directory to be able to make it easy to find people, make it easy to administer people, and take some of the sophistication out of it. I just want to say somebody's name and make sure that it goes to them. In a collaboration environment, I don't care about what goes on beneath that. The key to answer to your question is think about your users, right? We try and solve problems in a crafty and creative way, but we're solving our problems, not their problems. So that's the first takeaway from this conversation is remember what the end state is. Remember what the goal state is. That's why I brought up EDI. What are you trying to do here? And so everything that you're working with has elements that you're hiding from the users, right? So think about that. And then within that space, follow the rules. If you have a naming standard, stick with it. If it's not working, then that's something that governance will help you to resolve, but stick with it. Stick with whatever the company agrees to. I could go off on naming, but that would be that would be another hour.
Yeah, I mean, obviously naming is critical in building out a directory services that make sense or that will work well within an organization that's user friendly. So I definitely think that is great advice. Anything else though, besides just the naming stuff?
Let me throw this into the bucket, Craig.
Sure.
Everything you think you know about naming is wrong. The minute you move out of the Western culture,
well, you bring up another valid point here, Kevin.
Game over. You got to start over again, right? So This is a problem that every company deals with. And if the bigger your company, the more you are aware of this. So keep that in mind. Stick with the rules. That way, that makes it much easier to adapt to change.
So when we think of obviously naming's key. So when we're thinking about some of the challenges with modern day technology, so we'll say like later versions of Active Directory and how we've shifted our workforce to remote workforce and started introducing things like cloud applications and other directories, synchronizing different Active Directory to different directories. What are some of the biggest challenges that surprise you the most that we're facing today?
The cloud opened the gates to all kinds of things, right? Remember, the directory is the clearinghouse for who someone is and what they can have access to.
Sure.
When organizations lived in a bubble, it was something you could control. Then we started buying applications and services in the cloud. And so now this becomes more of a demand for your directory to keep track of these things, which you didn't expect to do. You're not provisioning those people. You're not doing the IGA for all that. Well, now you are, because you're paying money for it. You have to know what people have access to, not only to bring it on board, but to take it away when they leave, or take it, if it violates policy and so forth. So we're getting into another layer of security that we haven't had to deal with before, but we have to keep track of it.
So now we're talking about identity and access governance and really not just extending it to our on-prem, right? We have to then make sure that those identities are, because of, you mentioned it, we're paying for services now. And if I have access to a service and I'm consuming that service, right, there's a financial implication. So do you feel like that was that's a challenge still in regards to onboarding and offboarding and making sure we cut off access? Is that a big surprise to you?
Not just for the organization, but between organizations. So remember, you have three big platforms to consider. You have Microsoft, you have Google, you have AWS.
So now we're talking cloud platforms. Yeah, I agree.
Right?
Those are the three major things.
We are subscribing to a different authentication and authorization system when we move. Well, in the case of the latter two, we are subscribing to a different mechanism than Microsoft. So Active Directory has really stepped up to manage a much more distributed environment. And Microsoft made an acquisition of a company that could deal with the controls that are in place in those environments. Just a quick mention of what's going on there. There are different kinds of attributes to manage what people can do in those environments.
Sure.
And we have to normalize that because there are so many. You have to keep track of what people are subscribing to. How long do you want to let a virtual machine run out there? Do you even know it's there? Do you know what's in it? These kind of questions start to come into play. And those are the nature of things that administrators have to start to anticipate is, how do I keep track of all this stuff that's going on out there? Because, hey, company needs it. We have web applications. We have mobile applications. We have all these different environments where we've turned that bubble inside out to the consumer space.
But that's not the role of the directory guy, right? I mean, that's more the infrastructure team or the cloud team. They're the ones that are responsible for those areas.
Well,
I say with that little tongue in cheek.
Becoming diffuse about when you say that. It's becoming diffuse who's responsible for it.
Sure.
Right? Because the whole notion of a workforce was just a narrow piece of the puzzle. And Active Directory was designed to manage the workforce. But Microsoft plays in the supply chain.
Sure, absolutely.
Whose workforce, right? Multiple workforces, because we have to know who those suppliers are, right? That's why the automotive industry came up with a way to do that and outsourced some of that to a consortium. That's happening in other industries. That's happened in other industries as well. And as you deal with organizations, and I like this example, you take hospital information systems, right? Patient information systems.
Absolutely.
And you integrate those between hospital systems. We, the consumer, expect that you'll be able to find my information, right? How do you do that? So you have to do mapping between those systems. So yeah, you're right, Craig. I agree. That's your integration teams. That's your e-commerce teams that have to deal with that. But underlying all that, there's still directory services. There's still authentication and authorization systems. There's still resource management that has to be governed. So this is extending the capabilities of the people who understand it to deal with these broader communities. And so I would say that should be on your horizon as organizations expand, that it's not going to get less complicated. It's going to get more complicated. And the boundaries, again, are going to become more diffuse in terms of who that environment is. So we had that argument back when I was working at Gartner. Is consumer different from workforce? Well, at the time, it was pretty distinct. But logic tells you that the workforce is the consumer. The consumer is the workforce. And so it's really an artificial boundary, right? And now we don't have control over a lot of that. And so we have to have the way to do the integration between different environments. Again, in a global space, how do you deal with different countries and their laws and regulations in terms of the interface, in terms of the exchange of information, the exchange of intellectual property and so forth? It's been coming and for a long time, and companies have been dealing with it for a long time, just not under one part of the organization. I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to see organizations grappling with that and talking to these different groups, actually bringing them together in rooms to talk about what the issues were. And it's going to continue. We're not there yet at all. And it's really why that's why I can't get it out of my system.
That's why you're never going to leave directory. So let's pretend you had a crystal ball. And now let's look, 5 to 10 years down the road. What do you anticipate what directory services will look like in the future? Do you have any idea in your mind what that might look like, especially given the advancement of AI and automation?
So we're dealing with, and we're in the world of machines participating in this, right?
Sure.
So I've led you up to this point where I've said it's going to get more complicated. It's going to get more sophisticated. There's going to be a lot more moving data and interconnections between data and organizations. So it's going to become more of a, the term graph is coming into play here in terms of things that grow as you make connections. And I believe as we start to look at this, that will be happening dynamically. So because we've got the role of AI in this, and AI makes connections. And in fact, an AI will probably be part and parcel of the overall solution that says, okay, you're looking for this kind of resource. Well, today you can rely on the search engines to find those kinds of things, but they're pretty flat, right? In terms of what they do. When you start to think about the implications of the problems that we run into in terms of IGA, and believe me, this is something that it ain't solved yet. There are so many ways to look at this that we need flexibility to be able to tie these things together in a particular context at a particular point in time. And we can't predetermine that. And so we're going to need to be more careful about data governance, about understanding what data is, who it belongs to, what's its current state, because data changes. So we're going to need to be much better at understanding the information that goes into the directories and how it might need to be tied together that we're not doing today. It's going to change. So as we go through this next 5 to 10 year period, it's going to become much more complex, but it needs to look simple, right? We need to get past, we need the mechanistic ways in which we try and tie these things together and realize that all that's going to get pulled out from underneath us. And we will have different ways of looking at it in different contexts. And I think that's going to be it's still going to be directory related. Go back to the authentication, authorization. Who am I? What can I see? And then how do I protect those assets? And you add the cloud to that, and we just went exponential.
Sure.
I mean, that was the situation that we started to face.
Do you ever foresee that we'll have this universal directory where all identities are stored and we'll have just one identity to worry about in the future?
Not at all. I think we're going to see lots of different kinds of repositories.
So you think it's going to be more identity islands?
Right. We can't get rid of what we've done. That's another issue, is we don't have the ability or the time to go back and replace things that we've already done. So how do we make them work? And think about this. We're actually converging on a topic near and dear to my heart, is how do we have virtual directories? This is going to be the future of how we bring these things together. And I know
we'll save that for another topic.
Go ahead.
No, we'll have to save that one for another topic.
Yeah, really.
Virtual directory is obviously, there are already virtual directories out there and solutions, but you're talking about the next gen of these and how it all comes together.
Right.
So go ahead.
The other thing that comes into play in this is we're not talking about individual entities anymore. We're talking about groups. And how do we manage those? Because that's where it got really out of control, right? Is this whole concept of how do we group these things? And as it becomes more dynamic, these groups can come up and go down. In how do we do that? How do we make those decisions? I don't think that's going to be a human capability anymore. We're going to have to teach. Well, when I think of AI, those intelligences can't really do anything different than what we do, but we've got to think about how to train them.
Sure.
And you don't want to train them in bad things. You want to train them in so that they come up with the right way. And so, or you want them to learn a better way and help you to do that. It comes back to the data. It comes back to the ways in which we think about it and how we manage it. So we're going to have the opportunity to influence that as these products are developed.
Well, and you mentioned training, so that's a great way to close on. So we've been talking, off and on for the last couple months, and one of your passions is mentoring the next generation.
Yes.
So if you were to leave any parting words with the next generation coming up that are going to still have to manage, I'll call it legacy on-prem Active Directories, but also think about managing newer directories like Entra ID and other things like Okta, what would you tell them?
I would say, first of all, don't get caught up in the details. Because, and this is true in general, is the minute you become accustomed to something, it's going to change. And so we designed directories to be hierarchical. And then I just talked about graphs. So that all went out the window. And a lot of the prejudices and things that we learned are baked into the directories that exist now. So don't have favorites. Find somebody who's been around this for a while. Listen to what they know. Make sure that they're willing to share that, and take that to heart, because you're coming into it cold, and you aren't seeing the big picture, and you should rely on those folks to at least explain to you a little bit of a history of how you got to where you're at, so that, again, it's going to change. The only constant in this is change. And so you really need to know where you're coming from to move forward. If you don't, things are going to break, and you don't want that, right? Know your limits, but expand your worldview of what's happening with the technology. Always look at this as fun. It is fun, or I wouldn't be doing it now. I really enjoy it. But I started out in the data world, and I'm still in the data world. The directory is just another way of massaging data. So are databases and everything else. And so embrace that in your career, and never get comfortable, because
Great advice. I mean, with not just within the tech space in general, right? Or actually in any job you do, you always have to learn, right? It really applies to IT, but like I said, you could put it to pretty much any industry, because we have to constantly learn and evolve. So that's great advice.
The other thing I would encourage people to do is think about risk. When you there's good risk and bad risk, right? We bet money because it's potentially a good risk, but we also want to protect the things that are important. So be able to evaluate what things you're working with and what are the implications of what you're doing, right? And learn from those mentors and people like Craig and I, to not make the same mistakes we did. Right, you're going to make.
I'm sure I made a lot of mistakes growing up when I started out, and I'm sure you have as well.
Sure, there's code out there I'm scared of.
I've written some bad stuff myself back in the day, so I definitely have been there. Well, I do appreciate the time, Kevin. So thanks for joining.
Craig, it was a pleasure. I hope it's been informative for your audience, and I look forward to talking to you again.
If you like this episode of Guardians of the Directory, please be sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, or iHeartRadio. Until next time, stay guarded, stay informed, and be the guardian of your directory.